sing the first and fourth verses of the song, number 366. Let's sing. The church is one foundation, is Jesus Christ her Lord. She is His new creation, by water and the word. From heavy came and saw her to be His holy bride. With His own blood He bought her, and for her life He died. Mid toil and tribulation and tumult of her war, she waits the consolation of peace forevermore, till with the vision glorious her longing eyes are blessed, and the great church victorious shall be the church at rest.
Let's pray. Lord, we come now giving thanks to you for this Lord's Day you bless us with, that we can assemble here and study spirit and in truth. Lord, I ask you now that as we go to our Bible classes, that you'll give the teachers a ready recollection of the things they've prepared for, and that we will be students of thy word, and that we'll look to thy word with open minds and open hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.
Good morning. So if you're with us last week, then we started talking about what we would start talking about this week. We have 12 weeks left, including this one. So we have 12 classes to cover 31 chapters. So we'll cover 2 to 3 chapters per week. So we might occasionally cover a little bit more than that, because the last class I really want to spend talking about application for today. We'll do that throughout each week, but there will be a specific tie-in to what this means to us in 2021, our last week of class. But if you will, please go ahead and open God's Word to Proverbs chapter 1. As I was studying for this week, I thought, man, just before I closed class last week, all I should have done is just read the first verse, and I would have been able to keep my promise. But it's just too little of an introduction to really mean anything, so we saved it for this week. So we spent last week talking about Solomon, and the reason we did that is because it's the first writer we see in the book of Proverbs. Verse 1 of chapter 1, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, and then we see the Proverbs start. This is just the setup. Solomon is the king of Israel. David was the king of Israel. And we're actually not going to start in verse 2. There's a lot of things that are saying in order to, in order to, in order to, in order to, and then we get the thing that it's in order to. And I want to start out by talking about the thing that we're trying to get to. If you go down to verse 5, we see our first subject of the sentence. These infinitive phrases that we get up until verse 5, these are all things that this person is needing to do. And in verse 5, we get the person. It's a wise person who will hear and increase in learning, and a person of understanding will acquire wise counsel. And then we get a couple more in where to's. So we're just first going to focus on that subject. So a wise person, that's what the goal is here. And all these other verses that are preceding and the couple that come right after it, we're focused on the wise person. That's the goal. And the wise person will hear and increase in learning, and a person of understanding, and knowing that, looking back at what Solomon had asked for, what David had commissioned his son to do, what God had commissioned Solomon to do, it was to have this discernment, this heart of understanding. And so we're focused on that being the topic: wisdom, understanding. And someone who is wise, they will hear and increase in learning, and they will acquire wise counsel. They're going to listen to people around them who are wise. And it's not just what we would think as hearing acquiring wise counsel, being listening to people around us. What we're going to see leading up to this, and what we're going to see following this, is that it's much more than just listening to the wise counsel of people. It's some very specific wise counsel. All right, now that we know that the goal is to be a wise person, the goal is to be a person of understanding, we're going to go back and see, how do you get to this goal? Let's go back to verse 2. To know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and integrity, to give prudence to the naive, to the youth, knowledge and discretion. A wise person will hear and increase in learning, and a person of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. So we have wisdom and instruction, and wisdom itself, well, let me ask you, do you think that wisdom is something that you innately have as a human being? Is it something that you're born with? Is that something that's natural and not comes through nurture?
We have something with knowledge, and then that knowledge which we have to use that wisdom is to be able to take that where he says prudence, and that's to govern ourselves by that type of reasoning.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's we're going to see a lot that it's not something that comes naturally. It's not something that is just innately within us. I'm glad you brought up prudence. We're going to get to it in a second and just define that, because it's probably used more when we're singing Beatles songs than we are just talking every day. But so wisdom and instruction to discern the sayings of understanding. What does it mean to discern? To decide right from wrong, to really just to decide between two things. If you're to discern where you're going to go eat today, you're going to have a lot of options, and you're going to have that discussion, or you're going to go through the list of things that you're hungry for, you're not hungry for, you're going to decide what is that you want to eat. And so specifically here, the sayings of understanding, and specifically the sayings of understanding would be the guidance that would have been provided to the people at this time. And in a few minutes, we're going to understand who Solomon is talking to. To receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and integrity. So instruction specifically, we already saw instruction once back in verse 2. The second time we see it, it has 4 specific topics. 1, wise behavior. So it's not just wisdom being concepts. It is specifically in how people act. we have to be wise in how we act. It's in our behavior. Righteousness, so following God's statutes, you are either righteous or unrighteous. There is no in between. Justice and integrity. And then to give prudence to the naive. What does prudence mean? You have a little bit of context clues here with it's providing prudence to the naive. So we could either define naive first, and then we could do prudence, or we can do prudence, and then I'll ask what naive means.
Attention.
You said attention, and you said insight, discretion. I think that's good. Cautiousness. I think a lot of these form the essence really of what prudence is. Who are the naive? Describe someone who's naive.
ESV actually translated as simple.
I like simple. Yeah, children are naive. They don't have necessarily the understanding, context, impact. What's that? Lack of knowledge. Without knowing really what could happen or assuming what could happen.
Without that, they can't have wisdom or prudence.
Right. Right. And so, in order to not be naive, what's the opposite of naive? Wise. Yeah. So instead of simple, instead of naive, we're looking to be wise. And in order to give prudence, cautiousness, insight, wisdom, to really reverse or overcome or learn past being naive. To the youth, knowledge and discretion. So that just shows that as you are young, you have to be taught. We've seen instruction twice already. The youth need to receive knowledge, and they need to learn how, they need to be instructed in discretion. And so in order to do these things, a wise person must hear and learn, and they need to acquire wise counsel. Let's go to verse 7, because this is where it starts. And this, back in Psalm 19, where we ended class last week, this is directly related to that same topic. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It starts with the fear of the Lord. Knowledge isn't wisdom. Knowledge is kind of the beginning of wisdom. Just knowing what information is available to us doesn't mean that we will be able to discern with that knowledge. I know all of the restaurants that are available to me, and actually I don't know all of them. I know a lot of restaurants that are available to me for lunch today, and that's just the knowledge. As I start to think about what I'm hungry for, or the food ratings at these places, or whatever that might influence what Tessa really wants to eat, that's going to help us decide where we're going to eat lunch today. So the knowledge isn't enough. The wisdom is in the process of how we discern, and then being able to do that to the best of our abilities. That's the concept of wisdom. Now, again, the whole concept of last week's class was, what do we do with that wisdom? How do we follow that wisdom, or do we ignore that wisdom? And we're about to see a lot of that advice about how we do follow that wisdom and how we avoid the unwise decisions here in a second. But it starts, and I use the lunch thing. It's a simple, silly analogy, but at a much greater and more impactful level, it's how we live our lives. It's how we interact with others. It's how we raise our children. It's how we serve the Lord. It's how we serve our fellow people on this earth. And the beginning of it is the fear of the Lord. Now, God's always specific with the words that he uses. And it's not just the knowledge of the Lord or believing that he exists. It's specifically the fear of the Lord. And that's the beginning of knowledge. Why do you think the fear of the Lord? It's kind of like if you look at a similar phrase in a different context, we have the love of money is the root of all evil. It's not money is the root of all evil. It's this thing about the thing. So it's not the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. It's the thing about the thing. It's the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So why do you think it's the fear of the Lord that's the beginning of knowledge?
Because he has total control, really. I mean,
What
we
he,
are
yeah.
subjected to him regardless of which path we take.
Absolutely. If he were just there and he didn't have any say in what's going on here, it wouldn't really matter. He's just there and we can admire him for creating us and that's it. But if he has a law and he is the judge of that law and he has the final say in what happens to us and how we interact with that law, then we ought to care what he thinks. And if we care what he thinks, it's not necessarily fear that he's going to punish us. That's part of the fear of the Lord. It's this respect we have for him. It's this, it's caring what he thinks because we care what he's going to do. He is going to reward us or punish us, and that's part of it. Every time I hear you clear your throat, I don't know if it's because you're about to say something, or that's like it's like an audible hand raising.
You talking to me?
No, sorry. Patrick.
I was having a heart murmur. I think it's a solid statement. Ecclesiastes, as he closed that book, after Elijah's experiment, that it's the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole man.
Yeah, and keeping, those are two separate things too. It's fearing God and keeping his commandments. And we keep his commandments out of fearing God. And fear in the English language, to us, most of us today, it's going to sound more like the things that we watch scary movies and we're afraid and we have fear of ghosts or someone with a weapon or whatever it is that you're scared. It's public speaking, whatever it is. And it's not that type of fear. It's a respect for God. Patrick? I just haven't got a chance to say that yet.
Well, okay, you want me to say something? I was just thinking about the naive comment a moment ago. There's probably very few days that go by that I'm at work dealing with state inmates that I'm not accused of being naive. And I was just thinking about this while we're starting these opening words, because there is a wisdom that inmates have that they exercise that I know very little about. And there's a wisdom that I try to exercise they know very little about. And it's kind of reminded me of what you said a moment ago, that it's not just any kind of wisdom, it's a particular kind of wisdom. And when they say I'm naive, they mean the law of the jungle or they have their own world culture that goes on inside prison. It's unique to them, but yet it reminds me that in the world, there's a whole different way of operating, interacting, responding, thinking. Everything's different than it is with the children of God. And James even acknowledges in James 4, or James 3 rather, he said, verse 13, he asked, who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your heart, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruit, without partiality, without hypocrisy. There are two kinds of wisdom that God acknowledges. And there is the wisdom of the world, and there's the wisdom that comes from God. And I guess while we're embarking now, as we're starting this study, we need to remember that it's not just wisdom per se. It's a particular kind of wisdom. And like Don was saying a moment ago, or alluding to, it's wisdom that comes from God because, like you said, he made us. He gave us the law, and he did it for our good. He did it to help us, not to hurt us, not to hinder us, but to actually bless us. And it's foolish not to listen to him. It's foolish to take advice from the world. And yet,
touched on it a little bit last week, that God designed us, and he designed the earth. He understands our nature. He understands the laws of the scientific laws of earth that he set up, that we have discerned over time, that we understand how it works. We have our relationships. He understands how we're going to build relationships. He understands the types of relationships we're inclined to, and the things that we may be interested in that are part of the world, that aren't part of his plan. And so these laws that he gives us, whether it was the old law that he established for his people then, or the new law that he has established for everyone now, he tells us how to live a life that will, in the end, yes, please him, but will, in the end, leave us with a clean conscience, with good relationships, a life that will ultimately lead to happiness. And it's not always what the world sees as happiness. It's not the gain necessarily, or the pleasures that the world presents to us. He knows those exist. He saw it in your lesson this morning. He saw it enter into the world, and then he has watched it for thousands of years just get bigger and bigger and spread throughout the world. He hit the reset button once, and then saw it all over again get bigger and bigger and spread throughout the world. But he knows that's possible. That's why we have the law. And so it's in order to avoid this unhappiness, in order to avoid our own destruction, we have the laws that are given to us. And we also have this advice, this entire book, that he tells us how to live a life that he wants us to lead, that ultimately will lead to our own ultimate happiness. And so that's the knowledge that he's looking to impart. And so we have to care what he thinks. We have to fear God in order to then start taking steps to follow it. Bob?
As you read earlier, verse 7, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." That scripture used to be on the front wall of an auditorium in the high school that I went to. High school with hundreds and hundreds of kids, 4 floors of high school. There was never a cop needed at that school. There was never the tumult and the terror and the troubles that you have in high schools now. That scripture was up on that wall, and it was in everybody's consciousness that ever came in that room. And I can't help but believe that the Word of God should be back in the schools.
Right there.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Here, verse 7, fear of the Lord. The word there, fear, reverence for. So when you look at this, reverence of the Lord, the beginning of knowledge. So we see the word beginning. So this is the first thing of the thing, or the first principle thing. So when we look at that, the reverence of the Lord, the principle of fear of the Lord is the beginning of what? That first principle thing. Just like Ecclesiastes 12, which Bob spoke of long ago, that the fear of God and keep His commandments. So those commandments. So those are the first things, which is the beginning of those things.
Yeah, number one, I love the term reverence that you bring out for fear. And knowledge is really the beginning of wisdom, and then this is the beginning of knowledge. So it's, even if we're looking at the foundation of wisdom and we see that knowledge is that foundation, that's really not even the foundation. The true rock underneath it is the very beginning, and that's the reverence or the fear of the Lord. So that's a great point too. Thanks, Jeff.
In Job 28, there's a good, Job goes through talking about what God knows that we don't know. He knows about the rocks, he knows about death, he knows about everything. And then he goes into the value of wisdom, and he talks about its value, that it's more valuable than any precious stone found on earth. And then he concludes it, "Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom," coming from Job 28, which is
you still got more to travel. But it's kind of comparing God's wisdom to man's wisdom. We think we're so wise that we've traveled that 300,000 miles to the moon, yet God, in His spoken word, created something that would take 47 billion years, and you still wouldn't reach the end.
Yeah.
The cross.
Absolutely.
There's no comparison.
Yeah. And
So to trust in God is wisdom.
right.
Amen.
And knowing, I think that's a good example because of that incomparable wisdom that He has, and knowing how all of this works, we have to care about what He thinks. We have to have that reverence for Him and that fear of Him, and that's only the start. And then right before we see this transition in our own Bibles, today in our translations, we get this last little bit, and that is fools despise wisdom and instruction. This little bit of instruction is really important to keep calling out every time we see it, because we have to have wisdom imparted to us. And we're going to see some specific examples of how that happens. No way we're getting through 3 chapters. We got to work on this format. And I don't mean your involvement, because it's perfect.
I won't cough anymore.
No, it's good. It's how I know you want to say something. That if I see you marking another page in your Bible.
And I'll let you have it. You know, when we talk about the fool here, who is the fool? Well, the fool is one who knows, but is not wise. Or he is also one who is wise, but who is not true.
Yes. And Solomon, even though he was the wisest man, acted very foolishly. We saw at the end of his life, or toward the end of his life, after he had accomplished the work at the temple in his own palace, we see him just spend the rest of his days being foolish. And he knew, by being the wisest person, what the opposite of that was. It's not the lack of knowledge. It's knowing what to do and not doing it. Verse 8. So here we see Solomon saying, "Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not ignore your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful wreath for your head and necklaces for your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent." What we looked at last week with David's talk to Solomon is really powerful here as we see Solomon's own instruction. The advice that David gave his son was incredible, and it's advice that we all can live by. And now Solomon is turning around and passing on his own advice. And he's telling his son, listen to what I'm about to say. And when your mother is teaching you as well, don't ignore her. These are good things for you. And then he goes on to say, if sinners entice you, if you're around people who are trying to get you to do things you know aren't right, which in comparison to what I'm teaching you. So I'm teaching you good things, your mother's teaching you good things, there are going to be people in this world who are going to do the opposite of that. Don't listen to them. If they say, come with us, let's lie in wait for blood, let's ambush the innocent without cause, let's swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole like those who go down to the pit, we will find all kinds of precious wealth, we will fill our houses with plunder, throw in your lot with us, we will all have one money bag. First of all, what are the people in his kingdom doing? These are not the types of sins I was up against when I was a kid. I didn't have my parents are here with us this morning, and they were like, hey, look, if people come along and hey, let's go kill these other people, don't do it. That was just kind of understood. There were a whole lot of rules, believe me, but it wasn't those. That was, of course, understood. I'm not saying that was allowed, but so this really could be anything. It could be anything that goes against God's will in these quotes. If he said, if they say, let's, and then fill in the blank with things that we know aren't right. In the end, don't do it. And whether this was something that likely would have happened, and I'm sure it was, I'm sure this was something. We saw an entire chapter where Solomon just goes through and executes people, and we assume these are all good things that he did. This would have been something that his son would have been faced with. or that the people would have been faced with, and that they needed to hear as advice not to do, not to give into. And there is a specific thing here. It's not just out of malice for people. It's about taking things. It's don't go plunder. Don't go robbing. And if in order to do that you have to kill people in the process, don't do that. He continues, verse 15, my son, do not walk on the way with them. Keep your feet from their path. Don't even get close to them. It's not just don't listen to them, but you know these types of people. You know them by how they live. And by how they live, don't spend your time with them. For their feet run to evil, and they are quick to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird. And this is great advice. If a bird sees you baiting a net, it's going to understand that it's going to be caught. And so if you were to see someone baiting a net, you know what they're doing. If you see these people by their actions, you know how they're living their lives, don't spend your time with them. Avoid them, just like the bird would if they saw the hunter baiting the net. But they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So they are in control of their actions. They have self-control and they're choosing not to use it. And in the end, they will reap their own punishment for how they're living, whether that is punishment on this earth or punishment after this earth. By doing these actions, yes, they may be spilling blood in the process to get earthly gain, but in the end, they'll spill their own blood. Such are the ways of everyone who makes unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. Patrick?
I have this conversation almost daily as well. And I didn't realize it. I've read Proverbs before, but I didn't realize how much I had this very conversation. Now, I've got several inmates. I've got 2 or 3 on my detail now that are in prison for armed robbery. And of course, it's almost exactly this. There's another man that still here in the county prison, state prisoner, who he just glibly, overly glibly described his crime to me. And his crime was, we were selling drugs in a hotel room. There was another group of people down the hall selling drugs, and we think they came into our room and took some of our drugs. So me and my partner went down there and we kicked him to death. We beat him to death. And I'm like, why? I said, because he took our stuff. And so, of course, my advice to them was always, now that they served 10, 15, 20 years, some of them, is, if you want to get out of this prison, because they're all complaining about prison life, they hate being there, they're miserable, they're mad at themselves, and make bad choices. The only way to avoid that is don't go back to the neighborhood you came from. Don't go back to those people that you were associating with, because that's what got you started down the path to start with. Find have a fresh start, a new look, new people, new opportunity, and you go on every day. I know people who've gotten out and are right back in prison. Other people have gotten out and been very successful, but the ones that were successful found a fresh start. They didn't go back because they're like the sinner. They don't hang out with the same people. They don't go to the same neighborhoods. They try something different.
Right.
You have to. Otherwise, you keep going right back to the same pattern.
Yeah, it's godly wisdom that you're imparting. You're not quoting scripture to them in that moment. But obviously this is advice that God wanted us to have, and you're passing it along. And can be for any of us. Any sin that we're wrapped up in, the way to avoid it is to remove ourselves from that situation, to create better habits, to create different habits, to get away from the things that made that sin possible in the first place. Verse 20. This is, I just love this. As a words person, as someone who loves literature, we get to see wisdom personified as a woman.
But you're a guy.
And we get to see how she would act if she were a person, how wisdom would act if it were a person. Wisdom shouts in the street. So this is something that is not quiet. Wisdom is not hidden from anyone. It's not anything that is difficult to come by. Wisdom is out there for everyone to come to. Wisdom is shouting in the street. If you were walking down any street, literally any street that you're familiar with, and there was someone shouting, you can't miss them. There have been times when I'm walking through cities or whatnot, and there are people shouting in the street, or they're shouting on a subway, or they're wherever it is. You can't miss them. You want to get away from them most of the time. But if someone were shouting something, you can tell that it's like fun or a street musician, something like that, or I really like street magicians. I think that's really cool, like the stuff they're able to do and what they're trying to get. They're shouting that they want people to come up and see the tricks they're doing. You gravitate toward those people. But regardless of what they're trying to get you to do, or if they're just shouting because they're crazy, you can't miss them. And so here, immediately, we get a mental image of wisdom being in a street, being loud, and it's something you can't miss. She raises her voice in the public square. At the head of the noisy streets, she cries out. At the entrance of the gates in the city, she declares her sayings. Now, notice here, it's not a quiet street. This is at the head of noisy streets. And life is a noisy street. And there are a lot of conflicting ideas out there. There's a lot of just knowledge out there to be had. And in the midst of all that noise in our life, wisdom is still there, and it is something that is easily found, that we can find. At the entrance of the gates in the city, she declares her sayings, "How long, you naive ones, will you love simplistic thinking? And how long will scoffers delight in themselves scoffing? And fools hate knowledge. Turn to my rebuke. Behold, I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I called and you refused." Back to your point, Jeff. It's wisdom was there and they're turning away from it. They're naive. They're simple. They're fools. Because I called and you refused, I stretched out my hand and no one paid attention. So wisdom is there. She's loud. She's calling out. And even though she stretched out her hand for you to interact, so if someone's stretching out their hand, the mental image there is that you take their hand. And that if you take their hand, you're joined with them. And so even though wisdom's hand was outstretched, you ignored it. So you didn't interact with that available wisdom to you. You ignored it. You scoffed at it. You rebuked it. You refused it.
Psalm 14, what says the fool that said in his heart there is no God. So there is that person or that figure in which we can see that they don't care about knowledge.
Right.
It's just like the world today. They don't care about what God has to say in His Word. They don't want it.
Yeah.
They don't care for it. They don't want to hear it. So therefore, there was lack of that knowledge.
Yeah, it's the total opposite of the fear of God. It's a don't care about not just his sayings, but about him. You don't have that fear, and it renders you a fool without that care, that fear of him, that reverence of him.
So if God says you're a fool, you're a fool.
Right. You neglected all my advice and did not want my rebuke. I will also laugh at your disaster. I will mock when your dread comes like a storm, and your disaster comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. So your dread comes like a storm. The mental image here of your disaster coming like a whirlwind. Whirlwind it appears, it pops up, and it causes destruction in its wake. Same with the storms. Storms are something that, yes, the meteorologist can determine that they're coming up. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they show up faster. Sometimes they show up with varying degrees of intensity. But they just come upon us. And sometimes they just come out of nowhere. Nothing was predicted and something shows up. But it generally is going to have some effect. And this isn't like a rainstorm, a storm that can cause negative impact. And when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. So we see here that the fear of the Lord is a choice we all have. And it is often when people are at their lowest that they want to seek wisdom, that they could have been seeking it all along. They could have joined in with wisdom. They could have created that relationship with wisdom by fearing the Lord, by having that foundation of knowledge, by listening to the instruction of those who are wise, by listening to God's will. But then when their disaster comes, when distress and anguish come upon them, that's when they will turn to wisdom, but wisdom will not answer. And they will not be able to find wisdom at that point. They did not, verse 30, they did not accept my advice. They disdainfully rejected every rebuke from me. So they shall eat of their fruit of their own way and be filled with their own schemes. For the faithlessness of the naive will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will live securely and will be at ease from the dread of evil. All right, one main point I want to make before we close, and then I'll open up for thoughts as we got through one chapter. Instruction isn't just a lecture. I work in the training industry, and there's this, instructors like to instruct a lot, and that they feel like that's their job, and their job is to just pass along the information that's been written in the notes that are provided to them. And it's the same thing if you think about parents. Those who are raising children often say what they're supposed to do. But then there's this, no matter what it is, as we're trying to get people to do something, to change behavior, whether it's with children or in a training environment, or as God is providing direction for us, we see rebuke here a couple of times. Wisdom is saying they ignored my rebuke. There's this standard that we're all graded against, if you will, and that standard is God's will on this earth. And you have to get people on that. You have to be able to identify when people aren't living to that standard. So in the training environment, if you're trying to teach someone how to do something, you have to observe whether they're doing it or not. And if they aren't, you have to tell them that they aren't so they can. And even though in a corporate world it's not going to sound like a rebuke, that's really the concept of rebuking someone. And so as parents, we have to be able to, we provide the standard for our children, and we tell them what the rules are, and then we have to, when they aren't following the rules, we have to tell them they aren't following the rules so they can learn to follow the rules. Same thing in this life. God gives us a standard to follow. He gives us his law, and we have to be able to know when we aren't following that law so we can learn to follow that law. And wisdom here is saying, you didn't listen to my rebuke. You weren't, even though I told you how to get to living right, you still chose not to do it. There are a lot of ways that can happen. God uses his people, even today, to understand when people aren't living to that standard. It's why we have a lot of the processes we follow as the church on this earth to get people back to righteousness. If they were unrighteous to begin with, then we need to tell them what the standard is, to provide good examples to them, to continue to work with them, to understand, to establish the fear of the Lord, and that they choose to fear the Lord, as we saw here at the end of the chapter. And if it's someone who has been living righteously and is now living unrighteously, we're to go and talk to them, and we need to tell them, here is how you get back to living correctly, or to identify, here's how you're not following the rules, so that you can follow the rules. Another way to do that is just by our own study. When we are studying and we see these words that God gave us, we can have this self-awareness that we aren't acting wisely, that we are not using that wisdom that's available to us. With wisdom, with her hand outstretched, we're not engaging with that wisdom that's available to us. And so we need to identify what we're not doing so we can learn what we are to do. But if it's not through that self-awareness in our own personal study, then God uses his people to do that. He set up a structure, process for us to follow to do that. But that's what I think about when I see this use a couple times here at the end of chapter 1 of the term rebuke, and why it's so important. It's not just about telling, it's about doing with that instruction.